Carey, and today we're going to do a little addendum to the last video about composition. So this time, we're just going to make some cool stuff and talk about how it works visually and how, in the middle of making something, we can get over some of those speed bumps that sometimes get in the way by using some of the principles we talked about in the last video. I find that sometimes in the midst of designing a frame or making an image, there may be a point at which I step back and go, oh my god, this looks super dumb, I don't know why. And the reason may be that I launched into an idea too early and it didn't develop, so the concept is kind of missing. Or maybe it's a good idea, but the composition just sucks. Now if it's both, I'm basically in the toilet, and it's time to go eat a bunch of Twinkies and cry myself to sleep because, oh my god, my life is over. You don't even understand. Look at this, obviously the real failure here is the camo pants. If it's a cool idea, but the composition just sucks, then it always helps to go back to the basics and start looking at how each of the contrasts is being used and how things like hierarchy and read order are playing out as a result. So let's make a mess and see where it goes. We'll keep it simple and stay with the old circles as our main element, like in the last video. And because obviously circles are the best, now I was trying to figure out what sort of random thing I might make, and had been thinking about this friend of mine who's been backpacking around South America, hiking in the mountains, and I thought there might be something in the idea of exploring wilderness. So I grabbed some photos for raw material and just got straight into the process of building a composition with them without worrying too much about what it was going to be about specifically. Now that's not always a great strategy, but sometimes it can actually lead you to unexpected places. Because kind of like how when you're staring up at the clouds, you pull out shapes or see characters or whole scenes or whatever, when you start throwing stuff into the frame and working with it, your brain starts picking stuff out in that same way, and it can suggest avenues to go down. You start seeing things in what's there, or maybe little narratives start occurring to you as your brain is going about its regular business of making sense of what it's looking at. So I just messed with these basic elements a little, creating contrast between foreground and background, fussing with a bit of drop shadow to pop that circle out a bit. And when I lined up the light and dark areas of her skin and hair with the clouds and shadow, it created some significant shapes here that the eye can travel along, and that integrates the circle with the background. And I honestly felt like with a few adjustments, I could be finished right there. Because a composition doesn't have to be complicated to work well, and I kind of like this. The meaning of the thing is fairly ambiguous, but in a kind of nice way. Although the point of making this was to explore the process of building a composition, so we'll keep a copy and try some more stuff. So I thought, well, let's see if we can get a little bit more specific. Specificity is usually about the details, but there isn't much I could think to do with the details of the images that are already there, the girl in the mountain. So here come some hikers. My thought was, okay, the girl in the mountain is abstract and really vague. I mean, it could be about spirituality or who knows what. But if I bring these hikers in, then suddenly it's kind of more about exploring. And so now maybe the girl is more like a metaphor for Mother Nature? I mean, it could be. I'm just saying. Like, they're real people and she's ethereal. So, going through the process of trying to understand what each of these elements means in the context of each other, again, you look at this and your brain is trying to sort out what the hell's going on, and it builds these little narratives in trying to make sense out of it. This is a collage, and a collage can bring together totally unrelated images and elements like we have here. But if it's done well enough, your mind gets curious and tries to sort out the relationships between those things and what they mean. And that's sort of where the magic of it happens. As for the composition of the thing, I was still really liking this sort of crisscross shape intersecting right on the girl, really helping her to be the focus. So I was trying some things to play with that or augment it. There was also some tweaking of the values between foreground and background, darkening up certain parts of the mountain image to let the circle have a bit more contrast against it, and really trying to create a secondary point of focus in the upper right, because the hikers are moving up and to the right, and beyond them, the girl is looking to the upper right, but it wasn't really coming up with anything satisfying. And then I thought, well, why don't I give them a place to come from instead of a place to go to? And at the same time, I can introduce a near foreground element and help frame the composition with a slightly different shape. So in one move, we're creating depth, we're kind of anchoring some of these elements to the frame, and we're making the frame feel a little less like an ordinary rectangle. That's kind of a win. Now this little adventure with the sun element felt pretty stupid, but then I thought, look, I'm trying to shove something up here so that the hikers and the girl have some reason to be headed in that direction. The hikers are, I don't know, ascending to Mother Nature, so maybe Mother Nature is ascending to a yet higher power? Now, whether this makes a whole lot of sense to anyone, at least it gave me a reason to put something slightly more intentional up there. And once it was there, the whole thing started to feel like a scene or a tableau. And I grabbed these sort of dramatic clouds and painted in some real heavy lighting, like in a Baroque era painting, where the heavens are opening up and the angels are And so now the angle of the cloud and of the light rays are both augmenting this diagonal direction we've been hanging on to, which is good because we'd kind of covered up part of it with these foreground rocks. And now these people are getting scooted around because they seem too evenly spaced out. So I'm varying the distances between them, which creates a nice variety of densities. A little pocket of people here, a little pocket there, because I want to build in more contrast wherever the image needs legibility or focus. And the contrast and density helps that without having to make these guys bigger or brighter. And I brought in this lens artifact image as a way to just get the tiniest bit of that purple to further brighten up some parts of the image because the gray was feeling a little drab to me. Now I lost the last part of the recording where I added these clouds to frame it more like those Baroque paintings because, why not? And I also took most of the blur off of the background mountains because at this point, the whole thing felt like it was trying to look like some kind of weird theatrical production, like this was a stage with set pieces on it, which is sort of how those Baroque era paintings feel, relatively shallow depth. So here's what that looks like. Now, on one level, it's kind of cool because of that weird Baroque stage play reference, but as a composition, it's a little problematic, and I want to back up and look at some of the places it may have gone wrong. So let's actually take some stuff out and see how the composition changes for better or worse. So here it is without the foreground and the hikers and the extra lighting in the upper right. Kind of makes it feel less cramped for one, because that low detail thing isn't down there kind of hamming everything in. And I'm not sure those hikers were helping that much in the end. They fit strangely in the image because they're small and different, and there's a bunch of them creating a weird but kind of significant shape. It seems like we're mostly trying to tell this story here and not so much the hiker story, and that's a problem because they're different enough that they're weirdly distracting. So without them, things get a little simpler. Not necessarily better, but simple definitely has its benefits. Now here it is without the cloud on the right and the hand coming down. Now the activity is sort of shifted over to the left because that's where the most density and detail is. But because it's only sort of where the most detail is, I would tend to want to make that more definite and push the girl and maybe the mountain both over to the left. Because if you're going to do it, do it. Kind of doing it kind of makes things a mess. The closer you are to an even smear of detail, the closer we are to not knowing where to look. So it's the difference between this and this. Yeah, remember that? Remember that from like last time? Oh man, good times, good times. Okay, here it is without any clouds. Now, this big area up here doesn't have much going on, so it's effectively negative space. We kind of got this crisscross movement back again, but I don't know that that's all that interesting, really, because it doesn't go anywhere. It's just contained here. It doesn't really let the eye travel. It's a little aimless. The details sort of spread around haphazardly. Each of these elements is kind of asking for attention in its own way because they're all unique in terms of shape and value and so forth. It just seems like everything's kind of fighting with everything else, and the composition as a whole isn't really helping much. I think it's kind of crap. But if that argument doesn't make much sense, I guarantee it's because I'm full of crap. Now here it is stripped back to basically what we had in the first couple minutes. So we pretty much just have the focal element centered and contrasted against this other smaller circle sitting behind it. And the mountain is blurred a bit again to reduce the level of detail back there. The lighting is still here, and without that foreground object in the lower left, that opens things up a bit for the eye to travel freely along this diagonal. Having taken out all that other stuff, we lose something from the image, but sometimes when you're grinding away on a composition, especially if it's not going very well, it really helps to rewind and see if it's gotten better or worse, and to maybe make some drastic moves. I kind of like this simple composition, although it doesn't really convey much. It's sort of hard to make definite choices here because we don't really have a goal for the image. And that really highlights the idea that this is art and, by definition, not design. We don't really have any way of measuring our success because we don't have a goal against which to measure it, which is exactly what delineates design from art. But we don't necessarily need defined goals to talk about composition. And as far as the composition is concerned, I think in the end I'd go with one of these three. Well, we could keep working on that one, but I think it served its purpose, so let's do another and come at it from a whole different direction. And for some reason, I was really jazzed about a topographical map I saw somewhere and thought I'd try to make something along those lines. Now, I might have tried to draw it in Illustrator, but I figured there had to be a procedural way to get these sort of shapes, and that would allow for a lot of flexibility. So in a rare feat of technical wizardry, I tricked After Effects into making it for me with some fractal business and posterizing and, plasma module syncing and high-level node-based mathematics and photon torpedoes and some field vector resonance inversion. I mean, that's how you do it, right? It's so obvious. And then once you've got that basic recipe, you can start figuring out your composition. And I realized the last two things we made were kind of flat, so I threw this into perspective to start the composition out with some significant depth. Now we have a setup where we can dabble with a few things, the density of these lines being one of them. Because of the way it's built, we can pack some of these lines in tighter and looser, create some real variation in the densities so that it's not such an even smear. It might be more compositionally appealing if we varied the weight of some of these lines, but that's not really how topographical maps work, so we'll just make that compromise. Now we'll bring in some new elements to try to create some subject matter. Gonna have it occlude some of the maps so that we can see where it sits in space and make sure that the scale of this second sphere is different enough to contrast from the first. And maybe we'll choose to make the first one more of a focus, so this second one's gonna get shoved off the page a little too, to accentuate that. Now, in trying to figure out what would be in this image, I thought about making something kind of sci-fi, but just had really vague ideas about what to do. Then I thought it might be cool to put a galaxy in one of these spheres, and that seemed like it was going somewhere. Painted in some light spill from the galaxy, which looked kind of cool, and dropped a galaxy in the other sphere. Now, the scale enhances the difference in depths of these space bubbles, and it's nice that the cooler tones also help it sit back in relation to the warmer tones of the big bubble. So we have a lot of things working to create depth already. The map lines are in perspective and have a depth of field blurring on them. The lighting on that plane seems to fade as the lines move into both the background and the foreground. The bubbles seem to be planted in specific places relative to those lines, the one in front being decidedly larger in scale. The colors of each coming forward and receding respectively. And now there's some focal blurring on the smaller bubble in line with where it sits on the map and suggesting that it's out of the focal plane. Now we've got what I'm assuming are stray stars going well off into the blurred out distance, so lots of things are indicating depth. But wait, there's more! This near foreground bubble is really going to help push that depth farther in telling the eye where things sit in relation to each other. And as we bring in more elements, we'll keep making that suggestion. This white one will sit nicely back here and really help to pop out the edge of the main bubble's shape, helping to more strongly define its silhouette, because that's one element we want the eye to identify really easily, and knock back the value of this foreground bubble so that the main bubble is brighter in comparison. And we'll slowly build a nice swoop of these bubbles into the distance, paying attention to how they sit in relationship to each other, creating denser areas here and there, varying their scales, popping their values against each other, and using some to occlude others to reinforce their relative depths. And we're always looking at how using each of the types of contrast can help in each tiny instance to make the individual elements legible and to make the composition as a whole more interesting to the eye, and to give it some significant areas to move along and consider. So now at this point we have some definite and usable compositional things going on, and the image as a whole seems to be about something. But it'd be much more interesting if there were something actually happening. As it is, we're just looking at some things sitting there. There's nothing really happening because there's no action implied. By having something happening to this main bubble, we can focus more attention on it, and maybe give the entire image some kind of thrust. So now by putting this big crack in it, it becomes the standout element, because it's damaged in contrast to all the others in the scene. With a few touch-ups, we can have this passing for broken, and I figure, what's likely to happen when a space bubble cracks? Well, obviously it's going to leak space crap all over the place. Everybody knows that. And what are the components of space crap? Stardust and dark matter. That's basic sciencing. We are sciencing super hard at this point. And one thing that's nice about all this space crap spewing out is that we can have a few layers of it and put one of the space bubbles in between them as a little detail that's in the same focal plane as our big broken bubble. Although I'm thinking maybe we don't want to make it too attention grabbing, so we'll brighten up the real focus a little more so they're not competing with each other. Kind of cover that little guy up just a touch, and also cover up this super crappy paint job over the space hole. Actually, technically, this isn't a space hole, it's a spatial rift, which is science for hole. So next time you get an itch downstairs, you can talk about how your butt rift is irritated. That'll make you sound like a real medical professional making the big bucks. Now we have lots of different instances of contrast being used in various ways, but one we're not utilizing much, and potentially could, is shape. We really don't have anything other than these rounded, more organic shapes. Even the space crack is mostly curves, and that's fine if it's working, but it's worth seeing what we could do with some straight edges and hard angles. By bringing in this graph element as a part of the topographic stuff, we can reinforce the idea that it's meant to be topography, because now it all starts to more strongly reference a graphed plot or map, and not just wavy lines. But by bringing in that grid, we also further provide evidence to the eye that there's depth here, because of the perspective involved. Also, if you can tell, now that there's an element with hard angles, it kind of helps all the round stuff feel just a little bit more round by comparison. It's nothing drastic, but the effect is there. And if you'll note, the grid also has another quality that people talk about sometimes, which is repetition. It has a regularity, a rhythm, a pattern, or whatever you choose to call it. That also highlights the fact that there's not much regularity in the rest of the image, and that the rest of the image is very organic. Of course, we're not trying to blow everything else out of the water, so the grid is dialed way back, just enough to have an effect without intruding. So that's great. Bringing that in works with the image overall, but what's exciting is that it also presents an opportunity to talk about a strategy we haven't yet, which is about levels of detail. Let's look at this image for a minute. It's a screen cap of some visual development being done on a new Unreal Tournament game being openly developed with the whole community by Epic Games. It looks really nice, and what struck me was that in talking about the design direction of this map, the designer made specific mention of concentrating on low, medium, and high frequency detail. And here's what that means, basically. An object like these pipes, or these columns, is a big detail. But within it are areas of smaller, more densely packed details. Details that are packed in with more frequency. For this image, we might call these medium frequency details. And within these, there are even smaller, higher frequency details like these. So frequency is about the amount of detail that's present in a given area. The higher the frequency, the smaller the details by necessity. And this strategy about levels of detail gets you to think about stacking finer and finer detail to create dense areas of great visual interest, while still allowing for big shapes to hold that stuff, and allowing for some negative space to give the eye some way to know where the interesting stuff is. For the most part, we have what you might call low or medium frequency details. So something else we could bring in would be some tiny map making marks, like high frequency space cartography elements. So if we make some simple little bits and arrange them just to get a rough shape, we can kind of see where they're going. Then we can start building out some of the characteristics and work in some ultra high frequency details, dotted lines and fiddly little bits like this. And of course, when we're building out those details, we're still paying attention to fundamental stuff like contrasting the scale of these circles against each other and where they're more densely packed together. And within those circles, contrasting the line weights and the qualities of those lines like value and such. So at every level of detail, this stuff still holds up and is interesting to the eye. You can kind of see the overall shape that this set of elements is creating. It's running perpendicular to all these topography lines, and it seems like that's interrupting the movement of the eye in a way that, in this case, isn't a positive. It's not working with the composition as well as it might, so we'll get them arranged in a way that complements the movement of those lines, and now it seems to work a little bit better. Now we're at the part where the image is like 95% done, but it's those last few percent that usually take the longest. It's paying attention to the details and giving them some love. And that's actually really important because it gives you the potential to take the good thing that you have and make it great. As small as the returns may seem to be at higher and higher levels of finish, those returns can end up being the ones that distinguish a good piece of work from the best piece of work you've ever seen. Like on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is the first crayon drawing you ever did, and the original Star Wars movie is at 99.6, no one's really talking about whatever that thing is that's at 32 or 75 or even 94 on the scale. They're talking about what it is that puts Empire Strikes Back at 99.65 and how it is that it's 0.05 better than Star Wars. Obviously, it's nerds who are having that conversation. But I mean, smart people are spending their time analyzing why one piece of art is just ever so slightly better than another, more inspiring, better crafted, etc. Because in a world with so much good art, it's that tiny bit of extra goodness that people are fascinated by and excited for. The cream always seems to rise to the top. So if you're making something for other people to see, it can really be worth it to look for opportunities to go that extra mile. Like in these little details. Some of it probably won't even be fully visible, but it still counts. And this sort of stuff is fun because we're inventing it on the fly. At this point, we can just make up little stories for ourselves about what all this is, just to create some internal logic that helps us make it. Like, I started thinking maybe these bigger triangles represented interstellar trading hubs, and the smaller ones were like secondary posts fed by the major posts. We're talking cosmic trade routes now. So it occurs to me that we should indicate these trade routes with lines, and that there would be major shipping lines between hubs, and smaller ports might be fed by major hubs. Maybe the circles indicate the various capacities of the major hubs and contain some data about nearby ports, and so on. Is anyone ever going to guess that that's what all this means? I mean, no. But that internal logic gave me real reasons at every single point for doing one thing over another. And while no one will ever know those reasons, and it doesn't matter to them, it does also have the slight effect of guiding you to make something that appears more purposeful, more intentional. In other words, it seems to exist for a reason and has some kind of meaning, even if that meaning is unknown. It seems like it means something. And in a lot of cases, that's more interesting than just a bunch of crap spread around. I don't know if there's a technical term for what that's called, but it's obviously super sciencey. Trust me, I have like degrees and do hardcore sciencing on the regular, super genius stuff. Okay, enough science, enough messing around with this. Let's see what we got. So we really concentrated on getting some significant depth into this one, and on the clarity of the composition. Making sure that important elements like the cracked bubble read really well by emphasizing its silhouette. You can see how at a lot of points on this shape, there's a relatively high amount of contrasted value to make that edge very definite, which helps to draw the eye. Now that bubble also sits right along the strongest lines of movement for the eye, which is basically here. There are some really low details out here that function as negative space to keep the interest in here. Also took these other objects that would have competed for attention and framed them out of the composition a bit. So there's a really strong focus overall on the cracked bubble. It's sharply in focus, again helping to make its silhouette really strong. It's noticeably bigger than everything else, except this thing in the corner, but that's super blurry and shoved out of the frame. It's got the most bright stuff and is the only element featuring these warm colors. The topography stuff would compete quite a bit, but that white that was originally really bright has been knocked back to less than 50%. So in the end, there are a lot of reasons why this cracked bubble stands out, and why we seem to pay more attention to it as viewers. There's lots of other ways to think about building a composition in general, other than this talk about contrast, but it seems to have helped here. And obviously this whole set of strategies doesn't speak to content, or whether it's interesting or exciting to anyone, because that's really about communicating ideas. You're not going to toss anyone's salad just by using scale really well. So here are a few things you might find helpful when you're making an image and it just feels kinda meh. Levels of detail. It's kind of a nice strategy to think about your main elements as housing finer and finer levels of detail, or higher and higher frequency details. You're still making sure that at every level, you're thinking about the relative scales and densities and values of those details, of course, but this kind of gives you a way to mentally organize the overall picture, and allows you to think about big stuff and small stuff in a compartmentalized way. You can also think about creating an internal logic. Sometimes you're working on some detail and you kind of stop and think, I don't know what this should look like. Or maybe what you're building isn't coming out very consistently, or maybe it just seems arbitrary and stupid. In those cases, it can help to rationalize that detail. Maybe give it a backstory, a reason for its existence that tells you how it should be. Not everything is easy to create a concrete rationale for, but if you can get a grip on the internal logic of an element or a detail, you'll almost instantly have reasons to do specific things with it, and build it out in specific ways to suit that backstory or rationale or logic. And not only does that logic make all of your decisions about it really easy and obvious, it leads you to make something that on some level seems more purposeful. It's pretty helpful when you realize you're making arbitrary crap. And when in doubt, take some stuff out. That wasn't meant to rhyme, but it did. Take some stuff out just to see if that one element that you worked on for an hour and are totally in love with is actually the reason your overall image is kind of sucking. This is really just one way to step back for a second to get some perspective. And you may find that making some of those changes opens up your options again. You could alternately just start shuffling elements around or dramatically affecting their values or scales or whatever. You just make some big moves. Really, anything to get you untethered from that thing you've been locked down to can help when you're stuck. So with this image, just like in the last case, we could keep adding stuff, taking stuff away, never really finish it. It could turn into a whole different thing because we really have no specific goal for the image, which is crucial for design. So this works pretty well for talking about composition, but in the future we'll talk more about doing goal-oriented work. I mean, I don't know what we have now. It's like a cheesy desktop wallpaper. I almost want to put a metal unicorn surfing on the stardust or something, because there's no accounting for taste. Maybe one of these big bubbles should be a space whale. It's so stupid. There's a million things we could do. We could texturize the surface of the space bubbles, maybe even put like continents on them, land masses, like there's somehow planets that have glass oceans and galaxies in their core, but probably space whales. Okay, gotta go, bye.